Welcome to the Map Semantics workshop. It's part of a project that Achille and I have submitted to PSL and got funded about map semantics. So the rationale of the project was to look for a consensus about map semantics, which is maybe not the way people typically present research projects. So we wanted to gather people who are interested in maps or work about maps, to find out whether a consensus is possible. Maps are the last chapter in a book we wrote about that 20 years back, almost. And it was basically at that point, I would say, a way to give some food to our formalists to grind. So it looks as if it was a nice application of the formalism we had. And why not try it out on maps? And then we had different interests in maps. I've been working for many years on epistemic artifacts, and maps have been the earth, the heart of this work, because I try to extend that framework to musical notation, to writing, to numerals, with mixed success. And the point is, at the same time, there's been a discussion which was originated by that chapter, and a few people participated in that discussion. So what I'm going to do today is to first introduce that original set of ideas, and then we'll see how part of that can be changed. I think it's a virtue, or it's an intellectual virtue that people can change their mind about what they said many years back, and I think we have to change our minds on some of the topics we defended. Well, of course, this is not going to be just a Casati Varzi affair, so we are really interested in maps, and we have this is going to be the firk topic of the day. And another topic came up more recently in a discussion which was originated in another work group, the Iconicity work group, let's call it like that. And I'm very happy to be able to see everybody who was invited this year, taking part in this conversation about iconicity. And the theme was the theme of certain types of uses of map and certain characteristics of maps that make it possible to use them in a certain way, that is their situatedness. So to simplify a bit the landscape, there will be a sequence which is more related to a certain kind of inferential environment for maps, which is the inferential environment in which maps are used for, say, discovering that Madagascar is not part of mainland Africa. And another type of inferential uses, which is the uses that you have when you want to use a map of this building to find the exit, for instance. And then you not only you have to make inferences about relationship between spatial regions, but you also have to make inferences which are related to never. So that's my predicament. I wrote things about against technology. This is my nemesis. So inferences about, not only about, say, impersonal inferences about relationship between spatial regions, which are referred to in maps, but also inferences about the next step when you try to negotiate your environment and you use a map for doing it. And this second theme is under the heading of what we call Borgesian maps or Carolian maps, because they provide a nice example. It's a bit mysterious, but everything will be clarified in a while. But I just wanted you to give the general outlook of the day. So it is structured as a workshop, and we are using a format that we use in different in other circumstances, especially in summer schools. But the idea is to have the morning a general survey of the problems, and then in the afternoon we have breakout groups working on some of the problems that we define or find interesting in the morning. So basically, as we are talking, Some of us are taking notes secretly and try to sort out some of the elements of the discussion and find a few topics which really look crucial. And at the end of the morning, we split into different groups based on your interest in some of these topics. So what I do, usually I post to the four corners of the rooms numbers corresponding to the questions that people vote with their feet and go to the corner, which is a way to make up your mind and see what other people are doing. Seems to be effective. And then we have this discussion in the afternoon. And for each group there will be a facilitator and a reporter. Well, we are not many, so there will be a facilitator, a reporter, and a group member, more or less. But it depends on the number of groups we make. I think we have to go. We're going to make 2 or 3 groups, not 4. And then there is a final restitution session in which group reporters share with us the result of the discussion. Are there questions about this very particular format? Here I have
the chair here is just by accident.
It's by design. It's the most important element of the day. So I don't think I have for everyone, but you can share some of those. There are 2 pages with the program. If you're interested, I have a copy of the project. This is part of poster, and then some elements about map semantics and the Borgesian project. So
I have a question about the format. So after the groups meet, there will be a report given by the reporter. Is there a meta reporter of the whole thing? Someone who reports the
I'm
report?
happy to.
Can you be that one?
I'm happy to innovate. So we never
how
had
do
one.
how do we capitalize on the reports?
Well, you're inviting you and me to be the meta reporter at the end, so we can.
I'm inviting you to be. But okay. So
I think you're inviting you and me. But this is a thing we can do. So this is a map. This is a map. This is a map. This is a map of Ethiopia. Somebody draw on a blackboard at some point in a discussion. And there are many things about maps. So they have a lot of symbols in it. They're colored. This is a very rich informational map. Is a map of the North Atlantic with a number of data for sectors of the North Atlantic related to the averages of winds and strength and direction for each month of the year. So this is for June. And pressure, currents. It's not very readable, but there is a lot of data which are on this map. Average height of the waves in different sectors. Things that you want to know if you plan to cross the Atlantic in many. And then there is something about the Mediterranean here, but you can see the Mediterranean is not visible here, so apparently it's not important. It's all gray. So there are choices that are made at many points when you draw a map. So this is Gibraltar, and then it's all solid land. So if you are in the Atlantic, you're not caring about the Mediterranean, and if you are in the Mediterranean, you don't care about the Atlantic. This is the interest of the Gibraltar Straits. So choices are made, information is displayed on maps. This information has different format. It could be numbers, it could be symbols with a certain type of coding for those symbols. It could be colors for land and for not land. There is verbal information. A lot of stuff go onto the map. So maps are really heterogeneous informational vehicles. There is a lot of them, which is a sort of a despairing element about any project for a semantics for maps, and we were sort of despair. How could you possibly fit find a semantic for which a kind of a one-size-fits-all semantics for such a complex thing. So maybe the idea that we had back in 1999 was to split the problem into sub-problems and just concentrate on everything which could be treated using a spatial language, so a language that could deal with the spatial information that is contained in maps, or could be anything which could be reduced to spatial syntactical elements. That was the idea, and we did this, as I said, because we had the formalism for dealing adequately, I think, at that point, with this the kind of complexity that seems to be interesting when you deal with the spatial aspects of map. And the complexity is, well, what I said, a merio-topological complexity, so the understanding of the nesting of spatial regions in topological and in mereological paths. So we can spend time about that formalism that we use. This is not very important at this point. It's just important, I think, for historical reasons we got there because we had that. And then we selected an abstract set of features of maps, which is the purely spatial maps, and tried to find out how much you can express by using that little of properties of maps. And so this is what we did. Basically, we introduced a notion, which is the notion of a formal map. And this is a simple move that as semanticist you would like to do. And you would like to do it because it has proven very effective when dealing with the semantics of natural languages. So in the semantics of natural language, you would like to be able to account for, say, inferences that you can draw in natural language. An inference from John smiled and Mary ran to John smiled, for instance, or to someone smiled, things like that. So, and in order to do that, what you do, you translate your natural language item into a formally well-behaved item whose behavior I understand because it's mathematically controlled and there is a theory behind it. So, for instance, when John walks and Mary cries, you can translate into P and Q, provided you have a translation algorithm, a legend, so to speak. So P is the proposition that John walks, and Q that Mary cries, and is a symbol for the conjunction. But you have other options, of course. You have an option of translating it as P of A and Q of B. So you move into a different level of depth of the analysis of this particular item in natural language. And then you try to see which kind of inferences, for instance, is one possibility you can account for when you reach this particular depth. So certain inferences are possible here which are not possible there. And this is what you do as a formal semanticist. So the idea, the heuristic here is very simple. The logical form of ordinary sentences is to ordinary sentences what the formal map, which is a yet to be defined notion, is to maps, to ordinary maps. So we want to move the discussion here and find an analogon to logical form for ordinary sentences that would allow us to account for a number of things that you can do with maps. And as I said, I'm staying here within the realm of things that you can do with maps at the level of, say, non-egocentrically interesting representation. So purely things that relate to information that you can gather through a map about an environment in non-egocentrically loaded terms. These things, these items here, do not look very much like sentences in ordinary languages. So P, A, and QB. This is unspeakable in ordinary language. It doesn't make any, it is not a sentence of ordinary language. It doesn't look like a sentence of ordinary language, except for the features that have been selected in this particular representational vehicle. So there is no expectation, no criticism that you are addressing to this translation just because it doesn't look like a sentence of ordinary language. It actually does look like a sentence in ordinary language in the appropriate respects. But prima facie, it doesn't look like a sentence. So do not expect, this is the, when we are going to introduce those things, do not expect formal maps to resemble very much to the things that I've shown you before. They will resemble to those things somehow, but do not expect to resemble them too much. So, and here I'm just quoting from that chapter. In a first approximation, a formal map is a regional space. To simplify the discussion, a square or a rectangle, something looking like one of these maps. But it could be also scattered over the place. It's not important at this stage. Which is, so it's a regional space which is somehow associated by stipulation to a region of space in the world. And this regional space, which is the map, is variously colored. It has color. Just colors. No other symbols. Just colors. So no names, no lines, no icons are to be found on a formal map. Only patches of color. Of course you can. You can even go far. No colors, we just have rational numbers, for instance, for points or for regions. You can decide otherwise. Let's use colors because we don't want them to be totally remote from our intuitions about ordinary maps. And colors are used here because they provide an unlimited supply of symbols. They're intuitively convenient. So colors are taken to designate properties of objects in the world. This you have also in most maps, which are, these are not formal maps, but they look like formal maps in the sense there are colors. A color pink here stays for something like is a part of a Northwest, is a possibly improper part of a Northwest territory. You can find different ways to define the color, but if you find pink here, you know that the region you're talking about is the Northwest Territories. And you have many different colors for many different properties. Of course, maps, this map is not satisfying this criteria because this is not part of the Northwestern Territory. So you have to work, say, trivial or quasi-trivial issues of disambiguation and so on and so forth. But then, you have different colors. If every time you introduce a new property you want to talk about, introduce a new color. This was the idea. And that a certain map region is colored, discovered with a certain color patch is taken to mean that the corresponding world region has a certain property, the property which is associated to that color. In all the discussion, of course, I'm very much at the limit of triviality. It looks trivial, but of course the problem is unpacking some of that formally. And then you have to introduce some conditions for, say, good coloring. You don't want the color for the Northwest Territories to spread over the whole of Canada, for instance. So if it does, the map is not correctly colored. This is a simple formal map. So all formal maps look like that, depending on what they represent, of course, but there are no lines, no names, no other symbols, only colors over patches. And this tells you that there is a certain area, a heart-shaped area in the world, which has the property which corresponds to gray, and there is a star-shaped area in the world, which has the property that corresponds to black. So the next step is compositionality, because, well, of course, there are different properties, there are different spatial regions. We put them all together in a map, but you make a hypothesis that you can go down the analysis of the map and find constitutive elements, and the map that you have is a result of a combination of those constitutive elements. So what are the elements? That's the next step in the analysis. And then we had a problem. This is purely historical. We had a problem. It's very difficult to determine exactly what the compositional elements are. So is it the left part and the right part of the map? Is it a color in a certain region? What exactly? So we know that it is not so easy to figure out what exactly the components are, even in language. We know that there is a syntactic decomposition of natural language, but makes us think that certain items are atomic and certain items are subatomic, and certain items are combinations of atomic, or are molecular, that is, combinations of atomic items. So what happens here? What is the next step when you evaluate? Is it the left half or the right half? But then is it the top half or the bottom half? It's not clear. So we had an idea here. And the idea is to consider a map the way it is printed. This is the simplest way to get intuition. The way it is printed, a color at a time. So a map is composed of stages or layers, each of which is a map. Each layer, each of those layers is a map. And the atomic layer is defined by two features. On the atomic layer, you maximize the coloring. So all color regions of the layer are of the same color. And you refer back to the map of which you are considering this a layer. So these are two map stages, and I did introduce the distinction here, but this is a map stage which is well formed and which is going to be used for the semantic evaluation, and which is a whichever map stage. So if it is colored here, then it is colored there. This is a condition for being a map stage. The condition for being a well-formed map stage is that if it is colored here, it is colored there, and vice versa. And there is only one color. So if you want to print a map, and you have block printing, say, block printing, you start with the Northwestern Territories, so pink, and you print it, and then you take a block corresponding to, I don't know, Alberta, and you print. But you can also print all of this on different pieces of paper, and each of these pieces of paper, each piece of paper here is a map. And so this is what we are going to evaluate. And this is where the trouble arises. But the naive idea that we had was very simply that, well, map stages like that, support a simple intuition, which is complementation, that when you, and which has been called the abscess intuition later on in the discussion, the map stage is true if the region that corresponds to the star-shaped area here in the world has the property that corresponds to the color black, and the region, which is the complement of a star-shaped black region here, does not have a property that corresponds to black. And so, in a sense, these items, map stages, are not exactly like atomic sentences in natural language. In the logical translation of natural language. They are. They include a kind of hidden negation, which is complementation, which is supported by the spatial spatial format of the map. But they are the units of the evaluation. So the units of evaluation. So once you have an assignment of true conditions to an anatomic map stage by conjunction, you can have the truth of a map as the conjunction of a different map stages. So if all map stages are true, so that is, if the conditions that I just told, if a region corresponding to the star shape in this case has the property corresponding to black, and the region that does not correspond to the star shape does not have the property corresponding to black, and so on and so forth for each map stage, the map which results by superposing, layering all these map stages is true. If not, not. And so basically, formally, the idea is that the semantics for maps corresponds to the positive, non-quantified fragment of first-order logic, in which you only have those simple clauses like P, DA, P of A, and Q of B, and so on. And so on. So it's a fragment. But then it's an interesting fragment because you can interface it with language. And maps, this is a point we would like to discuss, maps are there to answer queries. A map is an answer to a query. Where is this? Where is that? And you have to be able to, it looks as if you have to be able to process an answer to that query. So if the semantics is something like the semantics we are providing, it's very easy to find the interface with queries. Queries are formulated in natural language, and possibly they are processed by a machine, say, or by an inferential engine in a format which is the format that we're using for propositional logic. So,
how did you say that the map semantics correspond to the positive, non-quantificational part of? I didn't hear.
Yeah, to positive, non-quantified fragment of first-order language. So you can only say simple positive clauses. Okay. You're not. You have no disjunction. You have no quantification. Formal maps. I mean, formal maps that we are. So and this is how it works, okay? This is a map, and these are the map stages. So you evaluate them, and the conjunction of the map stages gives you the map, and the true value of the map depends on the true value of the different well-formed stages. So this is block printing for your. So. In all the mechanisms, I'm finished with the presentation. We have, this is a geological map, and there are instructions on how to create geological maps on different, so this is gisgeography.com. They teach you how to create maps, and a key element, of course, is to have good legends. Legends that give you color, the meaning of the colors that are used in the map. So, formal maps are not so different from some maps which are actually used. Some geological maps are just like that. Of course, this is superposed to some kind of independent informational set that tells you where are the different items in a given region. But suppose you have an assignment for this region, well, you should be able to figure out where is clay soil, soil, organic, potsdolic, and so on. So I don't know what we think things are. The long-term perspective here is to move from the semantics of formal maps, provided it is well behaved and we understand it, to the formal semantics of real maps, ordinary maps. Of course, there is a lot to be done. There is a lot to be understood about legends, the way legends, what are exactly the logical form of the predicates which are expressed in the legend. Sometimes they are quantified. There is some lake in this area. Sometimes they have complex mereological properties, but it takes a lot of ingenuity sometimes, and possibly not everything can be expressed through formal maps. This is we don't know. I mean, it's a matter of still, it's an open matter for research. A point which is important in guiding this research is that spatial regions work logically as singular terms, and they have an interesting structure. So they're not just the typical singular terms of natural language, which typically do not have a mereological structure. I give you just a couple of counterexamples, and one counterexample which is so this singular term, the county of York, has a mereological structure. There is, I mean, it's a syntactic structure, but also mereological. So York is part of the county of York. So York is a singular term, and it is part of another singular term, which is the county of York, and York is part of the county of York. There are cases like that, but these are not the general case. So, for instance, the capital of England. England, which is part of the capital of England, but the mereological relations are inversed in the reference. So there are cases like that in natural language, which have a kind of mereological structure. They're not very interesting. They tend to be very interesting, of course, but they tend to be anecdotal in the situation. Whereas on maps, singular terms have this tight structure, and this is very interesting because it is one of the elements of the inferential power of maps, that you can draw inferences based on the structure of the singular terms that you're using. Well, I think I'm stopping here and just giving a map of things that happen since is a rough map. But there have been objections to the account concerning problems with predication and problems with the meaning of a singular terms. So Michael Scorla has been an advocate of the absence intuition that he considers incompatible with the account we are giving, the way we are giving it. Sorry, not incompatible with incompatible with claiming that this is a semantics along the lines that are traditionally meant with semantics, that is Frege and Tarskian lines. Bronner has denied the absence intuition, so the problem would be solved for him because the absence intuition is not. The absence intuition is the idea that wherever a map is not representing an area as colored, the area which is not colored doesn't have the property which is represented by the color. Which is the
I go into it.
Yeah, we're going to that. And then Kulvicki defends the absence intuition, and to a point, and at the same time tries to save the predication framework. Blackson has an objection about the infinitary problems with names or maps, and we are trying to maybe rejoin some of these objections.
All right, so thank you. First of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And Roberto said this is not going to be a Casati Varzi thing, and I share that feeling, and I apologize in advance. At the same time, I'm actually quite excited because Roberto and I have not been together in a very long time. So it's a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts together. What I'm going to do now is to put on the table a few issues that have been raised or that can be raised, not necessarily in connection with our own framework, even though, of course, now that Roberto has outlined that approach, I think it would be reasonable to refer to it. But some of the issues, I think, have an intrinsic interest and should apply to other approaches, other views, other feelings about this whole story. I wanted to start by commenting on something that Roberto said at the beginning, namely that maps are really a very interesting topic because they come in a large variety, and the very idea of trying to account for the fact that we can use maps and that we do manage to understand maps, given that they are so different. Languages are much more similar to one another than maps are. Of course, we can generalize the notion of a language, so we have, say, a language such as English, but then we have the language of apes, or the language of dolphins, and then we have the language of signs, and so on. So that's a large variety, too. It's unclear whether that sort of variety is similar to what we find in maps. But just to give you a few ideas, I just downloaded a few different kinds of maps, starting from my favorite type, which is indeed, I suppose, how maps were initially introduced. I think the main purpose in the good old days, the purpose of drawing maps was to provide specific information of this sort, information as to where something can be found, and also as to what is the path to get there, and maybe also if there is some danger to signal that, and so on. But you go from this kind of map to this kind of map, or this, and they are very different. I'm sorry, Roberto left already. I have a damn. Or this, in a way similar, in another way very different from the previous one, very detailed and fancy maps with specific information, in this case about Indian lands of federally recognized tribes of the United States. By the way, a topic that I would like to put on the table, and I'll get back to it later, but I might forget, so let me say it immediately, is that many maps, if not all, come with a title, a legend. But let's say a title, because a legend, the term legend may apply to something more specific. I.e., this is a map of, and here comes a description. So this is a map of the Indian lands of federally recognized tribes of the United States. So it's not just a map, period. It's a map of something. I think this is going to be very important later on. It's, of course, central to the idea that there is a semantics, because if it is a map of, the of in question is already a key to its coming with a representational function, and representation, generally speaking, is a semantic phenomenon. But anyway, that's one thing. So let me continue with just an indication of how different they can be. Paris, you come many different ways of. I mean, this is the sort of map that a tourist like me would get, and in fact, I think I did get one like that, as opposed to this beautiful one. But depending on purposes, they're all very different. Yet we can use all of them. If at the office, the information office, they gave me this map as opposed to this one or as opposed to that one, I could use them for most of my purposes. Now, that being said, it's central to this idea that this large variety of maps that I've just shown, or instances of which I've just shown, correspond to what Roberto called ordinary maps, as opposed to formal maps. So the whole idea, I want to stress this, and in fact I will come back to it, the whole idea is that a semantics for maps, a formal semantics for maps, must be grounded in some sense on a semantics for formal maps. Before that, I want to comment. Sorry, these are the 5 topics that I want to put on the table. The first one is actually something that lies in the background of all this. It's the general question of whether maps are, in some relevant sense, propositional. Obviously, our account presupposes this. We don't defend the view. I'm not going to defend the view. I'm just going to say a few things why I and I think Roberto as well, think that they are prepositional, but some of the debate takes place already here. So if you answer no to this question, it's going to be difficult to, as it were, continue along this sort of project. Second is the point that I was already anticipating. It is absolutely important in this sort of project, I think, in any kind of project of this sort, that we do keep a clear distinction between formal maps and ordinary maps. And the analogy here is indeed the one that Roberto already outlined, the analogy with the way in which we provide a semantics for ordinary language of the underlying logical forms. Now, there is one big issue here that I'm just going to mention at some point, but which I think is important. It's an issue where some of us might in fact already disagree. The 20th century, the philosophy of the 20th century, especially so-called analytic philosophy, has been driven to a great extent by a certain intuition, namely that in order to figure out what there is, we have to figure out what must exist in order for what we say to be true. And what we say is not always visible at the surface. Our sentences may be ambiguous, maybe, as I think Gilbert Wright put it once, misleading or systematically misleading. And so the philosophy of language, from Frege and Russell especially on, all the way to Davidson, has been taken to do something very important eventually for the purpose of figuring out how the world is, but important technically because it gave us a tool to go from what we see from so-called let's say the surface structure to the deep structure. And it is the deep structure that reveals something about the world. It is the deep structure that is either true or false, and it is the deep structure that we should as well focus on in order to figure out what makes our true statements true. So if I say in English something like, there is an age difference between John and Mary, you shouldn't take me literally as asserting the existence of this strange creature or this strange sort of thing, an age difference. Really, what I'm saying is either John is older than Mary or Mary is older than John. I'm really talking about the two of them. I'm not quantifying over age differences. And the idea here is that we go from the surface grammar to the deep structure. And the deep structure then, that is, as we're ontologically transparent and blah, 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 right? So take Russell on, Russell's theory of descriptions. It's motivated by that. Now, I do not share that view because I do not think that we can analyze ordinary language so as to discover the underlying logical form. There's no discovery there. If anything, we decide how to attach a logical form to what we're saying, but you and I may be using the same sentence, for instance, the one that I gave you a minute ago, and in fact disagree on what is the correct underlying logical form. Maybe for you, for some of you, there are age differences, and so for you, the underlying logical form is indeed an existential quantification. For me, who doesn't believe in age differences, the underlying logical form must be one where the quantification disappears. So for Russell, when you say the present king of France is bald, you're not really talking about the present king of France, and so the sentence in question is not in subject-predicate form, as it seems to be, but rather it's a conjunction of three existential claims. For Meinong, it's perfectly fine as is. So for Meinong, the underlying logical form is subject-predicate. So there is no unique way to go from ordinary language, from the language we speak, to the underlying logical form, on pain of surreptitiously, as it were, imposing on the speakers of a language a certain ontology, namely the ontology corresponding to the logical form that we impose, that we as experts, in fact, the experts disagree. Russell himself said, his analysis was driven by his robust sense of reality. If you don't share his robust sense of reality, you may end up with a different analysis. So let's forget this sort of long tradition that takes us, as I said, from Russell all the way to Davidson and beyond, in fact. And let's at least consider the view according to which there is no discovery. There is, if anything, a process of clarification, a process, if you like, even of stipulation, a Humpty Dumpty decision. When I say this, I mean this. When I say P, I mean, and here comes the logical form. Maybe when you say P, you mean something else. P is a sentence, and we use it to express a certain proposition. And which proposition we express using P cannot be discovered by studying English. It has to come from, as it were, a sincere confession or a sincere declaration by the speaker. Now, that's going to be very important also when it comes to maps. We should not suppose that the connection between the two levels, the ordinary maps, the maps that we use and that we get in atlases and so on, and the underlying logical form is, in some sense, defined by, straightforward algorithm. There is no straightforward algorithm. So the second part of the project that Roberto mentioned at the very end, and on which all the work still has to be done, the one that takes us, in fact, in reverse order now from the logical form to ordinary maps, that's going to be just as controversial and just as open to disagreement of various kinds as the corresponding project in the case of ordinary language. Then I'm going to discuss briefly the property that Roberto already mentioned, which I'm going to call the mirroring property, the fact that there is an isomorphism between the part whole and more generally the Muriel topological structure of maps, insofar as maps are spatial objects, and the Muriel topological structure of the corresponding reality. Fourth, I'm going to discuss what Roberto listed as the absence and intuition. And finally, I'm going to mention a few more issues, okay? And please interrupt me. I mean, these are really just thoughts that I put together for the purpose of discussion. I'm not going to present a systematic view. I do have views also on some specific issues that go beyond our official topic, but so may you. And so let's make sure that we discuss every aspect that we find relevant. So let me start briefly with the first topic. Are maps propositional? As I said, our own project takes this for granted in some sense. I mean, there is a way of arguing for this view. Some people, of course, disagree. Our way of putting it is, yes, indeed, and the reason is simply that maps tell us something, so they have a meaning. Just like a proposition, a map represents the world as being a certain way. Just like a proposition, the map is correct if and only if the world is as the map represents it as being. Just like a proposition, a map is true or false. Maybe you want to say correct or stick to correct or incorrect, but we are happy to say true or false according as to whether it correctly or incorrectly represents the world, and so on. So all of these are reasons for saying that maps are proposition. In short, maps represent facts, or rather states of affairs, because of course a fact is a state of affairs that obtains. A map may represent a state of affairs that doesn't obtain, and that's the sense in which it would be a false map. So they represent states of affairs, and as such, they have propositional content. So that's roughly the reason why we take it, if not for granted, we take it as importantly and rather obviously true that maps are propositional. But people may disagree. First of all, one might object, we haven't discussed this, Roberto, but one might object that this is actually too trivial. That if this sort of reasoning justifies the claim that maps are propositional, then by the same pattern, lots and lots of things turn out to be propositional, even though whether they are is highly controversial. So take, for instance, perception. There's a well-known paper by Tim Crane called "Is Perception a Propositional Attitude?" If you accept the view that maps are propositional, or if you want, express propositional attitudes insofar as they represent facts, then the answer to Tim Crane's question is automatically yes. It's trivially yes, because of course perception is representational, and if what it takes for something to be propositional is that it is, in some objective sense, representational, then you get that lots and lots of other cases qualify as propositional, even though, of course, the debate on those cases is much more sophisticated. So that's one sense in which I would like to say our assumption, we stand by our assumption, but we realize that it's hard to defend it in ways that do not trivialize parallel questions. So we have to be careful here. There are even more trivial arguments one could offer in favor of the view that maps are propositional, but we're not particularly interested in those. But here's one, for instance. We can completely describe a map, any actual physical map. Forget for a second the distinction between ordinary and logical form. This applies to both, actually. But we can completely describe a map by saying for each pixel what color it is. And that would be a description. It can be written out in some language, including, in fact, English. It doesn't have to be a particularly sophisticated language. But it can be just 0, 1. That's what digitalization is about. So maps, insofar as they are objects of the sort we're familiar with, can certainly be described bit by bit. And such a description would be a proposition. And if you come up with a proposition, say in English, then of course maps are in that sense propositional. It's of course kind of trivial. I mean, that's when I say this is what digitalization is about, I actually mean something that's not so trivial. Similar questions might be asked about, say, music. Is music propositional? Well, of course it's propositional in this sense, right? Every CD is a long sequence of zeros and ones, so it's a proposition in a binary language. You can even figure out whether Beethoven's Fifth Symphony logically implies Mahler's.
It doesn't.
Well, maybe it does. Depending on which particular code you have. Since you have propositions, then. But obviously, this is not particularly interesting. That's not the sense of propositional that I think justifies a project devoted to the semantics of maps. This would be, as I say, a genuinely trivial alternative to the answer that we are sympathetic with. It's not entirely trivial, because of course there are cases that cannot be handled that way. The big difference between knowing how and knowing that is precisely this, that you cannot describe a case of knowing how, as it were, bit by bit. You know how to tie your shoelaces, but you cannot come up with a description of this sort. You know how to ride a bike, but you cannot come up with a propositional representation of that kind of knowledge, not even in this trivial sense. You cannot digitalize your knowing how. So not everything can be digitalized. You can digitalize music, you can digitalize maps, you can digitalize books and so on, movies. Not everything. So it's not entirely trivial. That being said, it is trivial enough for it not to be a particularly interesting sort of answer. So it's the first kind of answer that we're relying on, namely maps represent facts that can be true or false depending on whether or not the representation corresponds map represents states of affairs, and they can be true or false depending on whether the relevant states of affairs obtain. Now, that's our answer. Of course, as I said, not everybody agrees. Others, in fact, would say not quite or not at all. A classic, yes?
Can I ask, the first trivialization example was perception.
Think Crete, yeah.
Why is that relevant? Is it because we use perception to interpret maps? Is that how the trivialization...
No, the trivialization wasn't even that sophisticated. It was simply meant as follows. If indeed all it takes for maps to be propositional is for them to represent states of affairs, to represent the world in a certain way, then perception would automatically qualify as propositional for the very same reason, because perception too represents the world. But no one thinks, or very few people think, that perception is propositional just because it is representational in that sense.
It's a kind of reductive.
Sort of a reduction in that sense. Yeah. So it's a worry that that it is overkill as an explanation of the propositional import of maps. It would make many other things automatically and likewise propositional when philosophers strongly disagree, at least on that being the right kind of reason to offer in favor of there being proposition. I don't even remember about Tim Crane's answer, by the way. I think she does believe that perception is propositional, but surely after a very long story. Sorry? No.
So, I mean, in an earlier paper, as you remember, he held the view that the content of perception is the same as the content of some belief, but it's only at the level of belief that you have proposition structure.
I see. It's not the content of perception itself.
So it's a kind of content considered as a whole.
Okay.
And then when it comes to belief, then you have internal structure. I mean, given by inferential power of belief and so on and so forth.
Very good.
Also, you can have negation, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can't have for perception.
You can't have at the level of
Yes.
perception,
Comment?
but you have the same content. You can have the same content. So there would be a distinction between propositional content and propositional structure, something like that. So
Good.
they're one without the other. So
Yeah, which in a way is not very distant from formal maps and ordinary maps. If you know, in a way, you can think that the ordinary map is the one that's accessible to. One might think that it is at the level of ordinary maps that we get truth and falsity, whereas we think it is already at the level of. Right, times. How much time do I have? I saw that we have until 11:30.
What was the...
yes, according to the.
According to-
Okay.
So I thought I had plenty of time. In fact, okay. So not everybody agrees. Jerry Fodor's famous point in his 2007 paper, The Revenge of the Given, is a good example. He distinguishes between, on the one hand, imagistic, pictorial or depictive representations, and discursive, logical, or propositional representations. So there are different kinds of representations. Now, it's not enough for something to be a representation in order for it to qualify as proposition. And if you accept this sort of view, of course, then you are in a different ballpark. In fact, some people would insist that Michael David, but before him, Bermudez or and George Ray, they argue that genuinely logical thought requires a specifically linguistic medium. So maps are just not propositional in this respect. But then again, others disagree. You know, here are a couple of references. Ian Westerhoff, Logical Relations Between Pictures, you might be familiar with that paper, or Mariela Aguilera, Cartographic Systems and Non-Linguistic Inference. One of the big issues that still hasn't been charted to any significant degree is really the issue of how we reason with maps and what sort of logic is involved. Depending on our answers to that question, the claim by David and others, and in fact also implicitly by Jerry Fodor, of course, will be assessed different. Finally, additionally, you may be familiar with the work of Liz Camp. In particular, she has a new paper called Why Maps Are Not Propositional. It's not out yet, but available already on her website. Her claim is that cartographic structure, by which we understand the structure of maps, is neither predicative nor propositional. About predication, see below, but take the second claim that they're not propositional. The reason that they work in importantly different way from sentences. Now, I'm giving you this quotation because I do think that the debate on these issues actually may trade on a problematic ambiguity. Who cares about sentences? It's propositions. Propositions are the things expressed by sentences. I'll get to this shortly in slightly greater detail. But we have to be careful. We shouldn't put it in terms of sentences. I take it that here she's speaking loosely, but clearly, at least the sentence is ambiguous. By maps, she means ordinary maps. Then maybe, yes, they are like sentences. But the interesting question is whether what we call formal maps are propositional. And that has nothing to do with sentences, but rather with what sentences express. More specifically, then she puts it in terms of propositions. She says propositions, meaning linguistic propositions, are characterized by a structure that is digital, universal, asymmetrical, and recursive. And then she adds there is little positive evidence that maps exhibit these features. This is to say that, of course, any serious debate on this question, are maps propositional, eventually will have to depend on some theory of proposition or some theory of propositional structure. We know very well that there are different theories of propositions, and so the answer may, to a great extent, depend on which theory you buy. So, of course, if you accept her view about propositions or propositional structure involving these four ingredients, then perhaps yes, maps are not propositional because they don't have at least some of these features. So to be specific, digital, she means that they take a small number of discrete elements as inputs. Universal, they can combine a wide range of elements. For example, if functional application takes various kinds of objects and functions and delivers true values. Asymmetrical, she means that just one element must be of a type that enables it to serve as input for the other, or perhaps the operation itself creates an asymmetry among elements via the order of application. The details are not important. Since I used the terms, I just wanted to give you her definitions. Finally, by recursive, she means that the outputs can serve as inputs to the same operation. So if you think that propositional structure must obey these features, then it turns out that the recursive application, that the outcome is some kind of hierarchical structure containing nested iteration of the same type of representation. And she argues maps do not have that sort of feature. They exhibit a very different sort of structure. Maps, for Liz Camp, are non-hierarchical, holistic modes of representation. We may actually agree on this conclusion. The question is whether this conclusion implies that they're not propositional. It does if by propositional you mean what she means, but it may not, and I think it does not if you have a different theory of proposition. So a lot here depends on that. And finally, there are also people who think that it's just a verbal issue here.
Both Aguilera and Camp will be here next year as professor invité, director invité. So if you can hold your breath until next year to have a class.
Excellent. Very good. There's also some, and there are also people who think that this is a verbal issue, maps versus language. I invite you to look at this paper by Ken Johnston called Maps, Languages, and Languages. The semantics of formal maps as a necessary preliminary steps towards the development of a formal semantics of maps. Now here, the point about propositions is crucial. When it comes to propositions, what you see is not necessarily what you get, as we said earlier. I mean, surface structure, deep structure. You see the surface structure, you have to extract the proposition. You hear a sentence in ordinary language, that's what we use to express propositions. So perhaps a statement, which is to say a sentence as uttered in a specific context, and you extract the proposition that is expressed by that sentence or statement. So it's not what you see. Eventually you have to get it. You have to extract it. I already made my comments about a certain traditional way of thinking that there is just one way to extract it. But I'm not going to repeat that. Here, the crucial point is that there is a surface level of sentences, of things we say, we hear, and a deeper level of propositions, which are the content expressed by those sentences. There's no one-one correspondence. You can, of course, have that a single sentence can express different propositions. An obvious case would be ambiguity. For example, I went to see a movie with Madonna. Most of you will think that I went to see, Terminator. I went to see Desperately Seeking Susan. I guess that's a movie with Madonna, right? But no, I went to see Terminator with my good friend Madonna. She lives not far from where I live, and we went to see too. It's an ambiguous sentence. Which proposition among, between these two, and there are others actually, is expressed by the sentence is up for grabs. You cannot say that the sentence by itself allows us to extract one as opposed to the other. Contextual information is definitely relevant. You think I'm a philosopher, pathetic philosopher, so presumably I went to see Desperate Seeking Susan. Yeah, but I live in New York City, so maybe I did go with Madonna to see Terminator. Contextual information is relevant. The sentence by itself doesn't tell us. In other cases, it's not just a matter of linguistic ambiguity. It can be a matter of serious ontological disagreement. So you and I may be using the same sentence, there's a hole in that piece of cheese, but we really mean to express different propositions, as with the previous example of there's an age difference between John and Mary. Roberto, I hope you appreciate the example with the hole.
Absolutely.
Okay. So for the two of us, this sentence is indeed an existential quantification. It is asserting the existence of a certain entity, a whole, which is located in a certain sense of in, another entity, a concrete chunk of cheese.
We still disagree about that after so many years. This is incredible.
No, but other people, of course, would say that this is not an existential claim. It's rather a description of how the cheese is. It's just predicating a certain shape, namely being perforated, of the piece of cheese. So which of those two propositions is expressed by the sentence? Now this is where the famous non-uniqueness issue becomes philosophically important. I think the answer is no answer. When we say there's a hole in that piece of cheese, we mean to say one thing, i.e. we mean to express a certain proposition. When you use the same sentence, you may be saying something else. You intend to express a different proposition, and there's no way to get there. Also, different sentences can, of course, express the same proposition. Passive and active, or active and passive. Brutus stabbed Caesar versus Caesar was stabbed by Brutus. So all of these are issues that are very important because they point to the fact that there is this mismatch between the sentences we use and the proposition we express. Now, this is absolutely crucial when it comes to maps. Exactly the same kind of mismatch is to be expected there. A mismatch between the maps that we actually use and the underlying formal maps relative to which we provide a semantics. Because remember, of course, the formal semantics is always given at the level of propositions, at the level of the logical forms that we take to represent the proposition expressed by some sentence. We don't provide a semantics, at least, I think you can say this generally speaking. Of course, some people are interested in logical forms that are very similar to, or that stay very close to the surface grammar, especially in the Netherlands. They have this very sophisticated formal semantics with lots and lots of operators that allow you to stay very close to the way we ordinarily speak. It's the Montague program pushed to an extreme. Fine, but it's still at the level of propositions that truth and falsity applies. And so we have to be very careful here. Roberto passed me a couple of nice pictures here which are similar to the active-passive. You may want to describe this picture since you actually took them.
Well, if you go to London, in downtown London, in the city, you have this kind of totems with information about the neighborhood. And then if you go, say, north, you have a certain picture.
Say this one here.
This one here, which situates you relative to with ahead to the top. So it's not north-south oriented, is what is ahead is to the top. And if you go south, you have the other picture, which is the same, more or less turned down, not completely, because they're turning upside down also the perspectives. So for instance, you have a
so the you are here points to the very same point. That's the crucial thing, right?
And you have the two views which tell you what's coming.
What to expect.
What to expect. Yeah. You see that they're not exactly the same picture. So the perspective, for instance, of
take the National Gallery, which is the biggest.
The National Gallery, it's seen from two different viewpoints. It's quite nice. Actually, they're so confusing. Because they turn around and I never be able to.
So, but there's a sense in which these
nice
are like
design ideas which have not been properly tested on users.
Yeah. But if you get used to it, perhaps you can use them. But the point is that there's a clear sense in which these are two maps of the same thing, right? It's like active and passive. It's forward as opposed to backwards or something like that.
But they are on different sides?
On the two sides.
So
there is a totem.
So you're looking at them...
Yeah, not together, of course. It would be extremely...
No, it could be whatever. I mean,
to turn around.
So really the sign should say, you're here facing north, and you're here facing south.
It's indicated, I mean, north and south, or...
No, it just...
That's the thing.
As far as I remember now...
So these are examples of what it is to use different sentences to express the same proposition. Other senses are precisely the one that this is the proposition expressed, and this may be the sentence that we use to express it. All right, so third point, the mirroring property. We take this to be rather uncontroversial, and in fact no one has objected to this point. Briefly, this is the claim that the mereotopological structure, i.e. the structure in terms of parts and wholes and how they are connected, of the map mirrors the mereotopological structure of the represented world. So specifically, you have a map which is, remember, a spatial object by itself. It has spatial parts. A certain region of the map, A, is part of map region B if and only if the world region associated by the semantics, by the interpretation function F, Fa, associated with the first region, is part of the world region associated with the second map region. So A is part of B if and only if the interpretation of A is part of the interpretation of B. And likewise, A is connected to B, map region A is connected to map region B if and only if the corresponding world region Fa f of A is connected to the corresponding region f of B. Now, we cannot come up with counterexamples to this. It's important, however, to take stock, and in fact, I believe this is something that's peculiar of maps. To take stock and double check this claim. This is not generally true. So, for example, in metaphysics, there is a lot of discussion about whether, for example, material bodies that have a merio-topological structure are such as to stand in this mirroring relationship to the regions of space that they occupy. In other words, is the part-whole structure, for example, of my body isomorphic to the part-whole structure of the region of space occupied by my body? Many people think that the answer is obviously yes. So my hand is part of my body, therefore the region of space occupied by my hand is part of my body, and vice versa. Since the region of space occupied by my hand is part of the region of space occupied by my body, then my hand itself is part of my body. And likewise for connection. Since the region of space occupied by my hand is connected to the region of space occupied by, say, the rest of my body, then the hand itself is connected to the rest of my body, and so on. So there is just an intuition that mirroring works there as well. But as I was saying, especially in recent years, there has been quite a bit of debate on this matter, and many philosophers think that, to stick to our example, material bodies and the regions of space that they occupy are not so nicely connected. For example, you might have heard of discussion concerning extended simples. Or let's actually go back for a second to the famous and long debate on whether space is atomistic. Say Euclidean geometry versus Whiteheadian geometry. Euclidean geometry takes space to consist of points. Lines are made of points, surfaces are made of lines, solids are made of surfaces, as well, and so on. But ultimately, we have points, and that's how we are, how we do geometry most of the times. There is a competing view according to which there are no points. There are regions of space smaller and smaller and smaller, but you never get to any points. So there are, as it were, point-free or region-based alternatives to Euclidean geometry. Whitehead is probably the most important figure in for the development of such theories in the 20th century. Such theories are also called pointless geometries, but I think that's a very bad name. So let's call them point-free or region-based. So there is no guarantee that your views on how space is, say, pointy as opposed to gunky, to use David Lewis's term, apply also to the things that inhabit space. So you might think, for instance, that material bodies are indeed atomistic, eventually get down to some ultimate, material components, but space isn't atomistic, isn't pointy, it is gunky, it is, every region of space as a region is a proper part, and so on and so forth. Or vice versa, you might even think that space is pointy, atomistic, but matter is infinitely divisible, and so on. If you think so, then of course there is a mismatch between the two sorts of things. Anyway, Democritus thought that atoms have different shapes and sizes. Obviously, those atoms are not pointy, they are extended atoms, but the space that they occupy may have further merio-topological structure. And it is in terms of that structure that we can describe an atom as being triangular, but maybe triangular, no, because that's a geometric, but let's say as being, as having a certain shape as opposed to, in some topological sense as opposed to another.
But isn't space solely parameterized in a sense? That is, maps are objects in space.
No, exactly. The point is precisely that although, broadly speaking, especially in recent metaphysical debates, there is controversy concerning whether or not you always have this mirroring relationship. In the specific case of maps, precisely because maps are themselves essentially spatial, so to speak, the mirroring seems to be, in fact, in place. This is not an argument, except that we just cannot come up with, it's not easy to come up with a counterexample. Notice that this is purely mereotopological. You may want to add further features. For example, you may want to require that it is also geometrically isomorphic. That's usually not true. So here are a bunch of cases where, so if we go through the various projections, notice that the par-hole relations, i.e. whether something is part of something else, as well as the topological relations, i.e. whether something is connected to something else, or for that matter, inside or outside something else, they are preserved regardless of which map you consider. They're different, but the mereotopological relations are always preserved. And that's why we can somehow understand all of these maps as being maps of the very same world. Right. So that's an important feature of maps. They're not like, there's no room, we think, for questioning this very strict kind of isomorphism. Other cases perhaps are more familiar. Take this, which is the New York City subway map. Unlike other subway maps, this is printed on the map of the 5 boroughs of New York, and it is geometrically okay, except that it is compressed on the vertical side, on the vertical direction. So Manhattan is, of course, much longer given that width than it is represented. So it's compressed, but still the mereotopology is preserved, and so on and so forth. So that seems to be an important issue, although we may want to discuss and see how it affects our semantic account. In our case, of course, the semantics is importantly funded on this criteria. Fourth, the absence intuition. This is a fun topic, I think. It might be good to have a group to discuss this. So what's this absence intuition that Roberto mentioned earlier? Informally, here is a version of it, a statement of it. If a marker representing some property appears on a map, then absence of that marker from a map, from a map region, a region of that map, signifies absence of the corresponding property from the corresponding location. For instance, if you have a region that's blue, and blue stands for a certain property, and here it's not blue, then the absence of blue in the map indicates that the corresponding world region, the corresponding location, doesn't have the property expressed by blue. Where it's blue, the world is blue. Where the map is not blue, the world isn't blue. Formally, here is a better definition. Suppose color C appears on a map. Let S sub C be the atomic map stage induced by the coloring. So an atomic map stage is maximal with respect to the coloring feature. Let sigma 1 C be the mereological fusion, the sum total of all the C color regions in the map. They may be disconnected. And let sigma 2 C be the complement of that region. Then the claim is, or the absence intuition says that the atomic map stage SC is true if and only if the entity corresponding to the to sigma 1c, i.e. to the sum of the C color regions, has the property associated with color C, and the complement of that region does not have the property associated semantically with color C. Is that clear enough? So if something is there, the world is that way. If something isn't there, the world isn't that way. Now, this property is official in our semantics, in fact, precisely because our color state, our map stages are maximal in that sense. If you go back to the metaphor of printing the map, you print, say, the blue parts of the map only once, right? So you have the blue layer, and that has all the blue. If there is no blue, that means the world doesn't have that property. Michael Rescorla, in this rather influential paper published in 2009, Predication and Cartographic Representation, takes this feature of maps, namely that they satisfy the absence intuition, takes that to be, in fact, a reason to think that maps are significantly different from language. Doesn't say that they're not propositional, but they're significantly different. In particular, predication doesn't work the same way. And takes that to be a serious objection to our framework, of course. He says nothing like this is true of non-cartographic predication. Or rather, that's my paraphrase. He says, and here is a quotation, this contrast between cartographic and linguistic representation, namely that maps satisfy the absence intuition, whereas language, English for instance, doesn't, poses a challenge to anyone who holds that attaching a marker to a map, to map coordinates, is the same mode of semantic composition as attaching a predicate to a singular term. Now, why does he think that there is a big difference? Let me see if I have, yeah. Why does he think that there is a big difference here? I think John might be discussing this later, so I'm going to just put it very briefly. Why does he think that there is a big difference here? Because he says that when you say in English, for instance, Mount Everest is tall, or for that matter, snow is white, and that's it, and you say just that, you're not thereby implying that, say, Mont Blanc is not tall, or that that sheet of paper is not white. I.e., if you say PA, you're not thereby implying that B is not P. Absence of information about B concerning P isn't an assertion to the effect that B doesn't have the property expressed by predicate P. No, it's a long argument, it's a long story. But the idea is, when we speak, there is no presumption that predication works in accordance with the abscess intuition. But with maps, there's no question that maps are meant to work that way. Otherwise, they wouldn't be informative. They would be incomplete. But an incomplete map, in this sense, would be an incorrect map. Therefore, maps are significantly different. At least predication doesn't work in maps in the same way in which it works in language. Now, this is an issue where, about which we have been thinking for a while. One response is this, but it's not the only one, and I'm going to defer to John shortly. One response is this. I think there is some misunderstanding here concerning what's at issue. We're not saying that maps are propositions. In a way, maps are more like theories. So let's actually put it in terms of sentences for simplicity, because in model theory, people put it that way. A theory is a set of sentences, and in fact, it's typically a good thing if we are dealing with a complete theory. So if the theory says P, that means that the world is supposed to be in a certain way. If the theory doesn't say P, it is if it is complete, then it implies not P, and so the world isn't that way. Now, maps are propositional, but that doesn't mean that they are just like statements, such as snow is white or Everest is tall. They are theories. They are sequences of statements. They are, in fact, sort of complete sequences. What's not there is not part of your theory. And if we move from single statements in English to theories in English or in some formal language, then they do arguably satisfy the absence intuition. That's what completeness is. Completeness of a theory is precisely that. Maximal completeness means that if something isn't in there, then the theory implies the negation of it.
Are there actually interesting counterexamples to the absence intuition in maps?
In maps themselves, yeah, I'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. If you don't mind, Jérôme, I'll get to that in a second. So for now, we're discussing the view that yes, maps have this property, but precisely for that reason, they're not like language. That's Restor's objection. One reply, in fact, we haven't really discussed this, but I'm pretty happy with this way of putting it. One reply is that maps aren't statements; they're theories. So they're not just single sentences. They're not to be associated with or what a single sentence says, but complete set. So that, in fact, in my opinion, takes care of the worry because theories are complete. There are other ways of responding to Michael Restor. In fact, John Kulvicki has worked extensively on this point, and I take it that you will be telling us. Good. So I'm just going to say, I just put the name without even quoting anything, but that's a sophisticated response because it saves to a large extent the absence intuition, but also the predicational character of maps. Of course, his semantics isn't exactly like ours. There is a change. That's exactly the sort of work that we're interested in. But it's a direct response to Michael Restor's objection on his own grounds. Whereas our response, at least the one that you see here, is not exactly on his ground. It's actually a rejoinder to the effect that there is some confusion here going on. A third response is precisely to say, no, wait a second, the absence intuition is false. So there is this recent paper by Ben Bronner called Maps and Absence Symbols, 2015. It says the absence intuition is false. Its prima facie appeal, it says, rests on mistaking, and here I quote, what a map conveys, for example, by Gricean implicature, for what the map represents. And it gives us some examples. So here's one. Here's a map. We have three black, they're black, I don't know what color they look on the screen, triangles above the blue line. The blue line represents the river, the triangles represent mountains. It says, well, this clearly represents the world as having three mountains, say, north of the river. It doesn't rule out that there are mountains below. It just doesn't, include them in the map. The purpose of the map may be such that blah blah blah, right? Of course, all things being equal, anyone who finds a map like this is going to infer from the fact that there are no black triangles below the blue line that there are no mountains south of the river. But this would be an implicature, according to him. It's part of what the map conveys, but it's not necessarily or strictly part of what the map represents. Here are other examples. That's this map of some cities I have visited. And then it says, well, actually, I also visited Princeton, which is in New Jersey. It's not on the map. I said some of the cities I visited. This, therefore, it doesn't if you look at the map as is, you might infer that that he hasn't visited any city in New Jersey, but that's not true. It's part of what the map conveys, perhaps. That's a misleading case of implication. I actually disagree profoundly with this example. I'm going to say something in a second. The third example is this. National capitals. You've got London, Paris, Madrid, Berlin, and a few others, but not all of them. But of course, if you apply the absence intuition, then it follows that Switzerland doesn't have a capital, or Italy doesn't have a capital. Now, we seem to be on the same page here. Don't find these counterexamples compelling. And in fact, I want to say two things about this. One is that, again, this whole trades on a confusion between surface grammar and deep structure. Yes, it's a matter. The distinction between what the map conveys and what the map represents is a distinction that trades on that confusion. In a map, what you see is what you get, in a way, right? In a formal map, what you see is what you get. We said a lot of work must be done to go from ordinary maps to the underlying formal map. Of course, ordinary maps have lots of implicatures, like ordinary sentences have lots of implicatures. If I say, two of you got an A+ in the final, you infer that the others didn't get an A+. But that's an implicature. Some of you passed, right, exactly. Some of you. And likewise, if I tell you, here are some of, forget about the map. Here's English. Here are some of the cities I visited. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Salt Lake City. And then after a few months, I stop. I said some. What do you infer from that? Any kind of inference here at the level of implicature belongs to the way we use language. It doesn't belong at the level of the underlying logical form, the one at which semantics applies properly. At the level of logical form, there are no ambiguities, and implicature is implication, period. If you want to distinguish between implicature and implication in Gricean terms, that's because you want to distinguish between the way we use language on the one hand and what happens underneath at the semantic level. By the way, this one here, some of the cities I visited, this takes us back to the topic of titles that I mentioned at the very beginning. Some of the cities I visited, what kind of a title is that? So here is my title for this. Cities I visited on Tuesdays. Of course, those are some of the cities I visited. Now, this happens to be the map of the cities I visited on Tuesdays, and it's complete. I didn't visit Princeton, New Jersey on a Tuesday. That's why it's not on the map. Or for the matter, these are he considers this a response. He calls it a criterion-based response. But he says criteria are too loose and in fact yield implausible results. Suppose that I just flipped a coin to decide whether or not to put a city on the map. What kind of a criterion is that? Well, it's a criterion. Cities that I put on the map because the coin landed heads. That's perfectly okay. Now, each such map is perfectly complete and satisfies the absence intuition. Now, the thing is, if you want to have something called some of the cities I visited, then you're not giving me a map. You're giving me a block, say a pile of maps. Each such map is a very specific map of a very specific set of cities that I visited. And since this is an existential quantifier, each one of them is a witness, as it were, for the existential quantifier. But the existential description, some of the cities I visited, doesn't correspond to a predicate, so to speak. It corresponds to a name, the name of this booklet of maps. And each map you pull out of the booklet will contain cities I visited.
Can I try a different context?
Yeah.
So you have two colors. You have yellow and red.
Yeah.
So yellow means at least 1,000 inhabitants,
yeah.
And red means at least 10,000 inhabitants.
At least 10. Okay.
So when you have red, the absence intuition would probably lead you to say that you don't represent the property of having at least 1,000.
Perfect. So this connects to the issue of logic in maps. One response to this counterexample would be that this map is incoherent because it should be orange, and some parts of it should also be yellow because we want to represent by yellow the stronger property of being less than 1,000. Now, of course, using colors, we cannot do that. We cannot superimpose red and yellow. So we have to figure out a different way of representing those two properties. Perhaps we can even agree that by mixing colors, we intend to represent that both properties apply. In fact, this is one issue that we have. The printing metaphor was used by Roberto to indicate that first you print the blue, and then the red, and then, say, yellow. Now, it's possible, of course, and this is how magazines are typically printed, or maps for that matter. It's possible to, of course, have regions that are both red and yellow, yet orange. But then we have to, sort of explain the sense in which these properties compose. So red and yellow equals orange. So that's part of the logical structure, and I think that's important.
But still, maybe
But it wouldn't be a counterexample. Yeah.
That's simple answer, but these are not visual colors. These are idealized colors, so you can just somebody with an appropriate visual system will be able to see that there is red and that there is yellow without having to.
Yeah. So to put it differently.
But not everything should be expressible in a map. Sometimes it's not clear, but you can really express everything by using the legend plus color system. It's an issue.
But it's also that you make a choice. I mean, it's just a bad way to make a map, to make those the predicates, right? You'd want to say between 1 and 10,000 people, between 10 and 100,000 people. That would be the wise map maker's choice for how to represent these things.
But is a bad map a map?
Yes, in my sense, yes.
So
I think a bad map is a map. I think in their case too, this if you can layer all of the colors, then they'll just get these layers, right? In my case, if you want to insist on two things, one, you have that's what those colors mean, and two, those colors are incompatible, so you can't put both of them in the same place. Then you have a bad map. It's a map, and it does not satisfy the absence intuition. But it's also, it's a really bad map because you can't actually say what's going on about the area that you're mapping, right? And if you can't, that's just not a good way to do it, but you still got a map. It's not clear that they think that.
I have another counterexample to push the intuition that the absence intuition is sort of pragmatic. So suppose you have a region like, I don't know, Lombardy in Italy, and you have a green marker on which doesn't have any title, but we suppose it is a green area, and it's just in cities, and it's always just in green areas in cities. So no one would ever would ever get the implicatures that the implicature that there is no green area outside cities. So in this sense, how you get the map would be modulated by your background knowledge. And what is usually modulated by your background knowledge is pragmatic implicatures you get.
Right.
So contextual knowledge is insane.
Good. So you're suggesting a map that shows only the green in cities, but doesn't bother
Urban green.
urban
Yeah,
green,
urban.
right? Well, you see, but that's
In the
exactly the
countryside,
point.
in the countryside, there is no urban green.
Well, but there is no title. There is no title that says urban green.
Correct.
This is the point.
Good, and that's why it is a problem of, in this case perhaps ambiguity, but a problem of sentence as opposed to proposition, right? So this under determination or under specification, or the title is missing, or something like that. One way to rule out the counterexample is to say, well, there is, that green that you see, call it urban green, and then it satisfies the absence condition. So which property is expressed by a certain color might be underdetermined, just like, for that matter, which property is expressed by a predicate of English is underdetermined. When we say Brutus stepped Caesar and then we say Brutus killed Caesar, some people think that Brutus did two things because the two predicates stand for different properties. Other people say, no, he did just one thing because in that particular circumstance, the predicate stabbed and the predicate killed pick out the very same property, namely killing by stabbing or something like that. So predicates in English are underdetermined with respect to their semantic value. Our linguistic practices don't specify in a particular context what the property expressed by a predicate is because the predicate is just not specific enough. Likewise with maps, so one could answer that way.
So
Sorry,
now
I'm a tiny instrument here.
Okay, time is over.
We should I have to read to wrap, and then we'll
Okay.
take to that for discussion.
Okay, so I just list the other issues without going through them. So I skip all the learnability business, even though I do have a response there. So the four important issues that we think should be added to the list are learnability, the fact that we must account for our ability to understand new maps, just like we have an ability to understand new sentences. If maps are indeed similar, propositional, and sufficiently similar to language, that's one important thing. In fact, if you give me just 10 seconds, I'll read a more precise formulation of this. Just as the ability of English speakers to understand an infinite number of sentences can be explained by their tacit knowledge of the compositional theory of meaning of English, the ability of map readers to understand an infinite number of maps without having to learn what each represents must be explained by their tacit knowledge of the compositional theory of representation for maps. This is from a paper by Ben Blumson that Roberto mentioned earlier, Maps and Meaning. The objection is that our framework doesn't handle this problem. We have responses, but we'll skip. The other issues to leave on the table now are, well, mentioned already a few times, the limits of cartographic expressiveness. Map purposes. I mean, maps are things that are usually drawn for a purpose. That's the title business. Maps come with an implicit title. And if it is obscure what the title is, they're useless. Or they are definitely subject to pragmatic misuses. Typically, a map is an answer to a query and so on and so forth. And finally, of course, map uses. How do we use maps? I didn't list here logic or let's say the inferential, the ability to account for inferences using maps, because I mentioned that at the very beginning, but that's of course another issue, and in fact this last discussion and Jérôme's question is indicative of how important it is to get clear about the logical structure of maps, how conjunction, disjunction, and maybe even quantification. Roberto said that it's quantifier free, but
Formal maps.
yeah, but there is no reason to. There is no argument that they should be. It's just a limitation of our account. So more generally than the logical structure. Sorry, it took me longer than I thought.